You're listening to another podcast on I'dRatherBeWriting.com. Today, I am talking with Fabrizio Ferri Benedetti, who's based in Barcelona, Spain. And we are chatting about just various news articles and particularly AI sort of related news, more of an informal discussion and chat. Fabrizio, can you just introduce yourself a little bit? Tell listeners kind of who you are, where you're based, what your interests are.
Right. Well, first of all, good morning, Tom. Thank you for inviting me to your podcast. I'm Fabrizio Ferri Benedetti. That's the right pronunciation, by the way. Don't worry about that. Everybody got it wrong. And yeah, I'm based in Barcelona, Spain. I work for Splunk as a principal technical writer for observability, rather technical stuff. I do also open source documentation for open telemetry. So that's my job currently. Yeah.
Cool. I'm excited that you've got experience in open source documentation. I feel like that's an area a lot of people are curious about. I mean, especially tech writers building portfolios or just people who want to get involved in that space. Right. So we'll jump into that a little bit later.
Yeah.
So I've got a list of articles that I think are going to be good fodder for discussion. And one of these near the top gets us right into this AI discussion. There's a report from Forrester that's talking about generative AI jobs impact forecasts and kind of like how things are going to play out. And the gist of it is that any job that's subject to both influence and automation is kind of ripe for being eliminated. A lot of jobs are subject to influence only by AI, meaning you could use the tools of AI to do parts of it, but not all of it. And then other jobs where you can do all of it. What are your thoughts on that, Fabrizio? Like, I think this usually provokes a lot of strong reactions from tech writers, and most of us are very dismissive of it. But what's your general gist of that?
So as you might have gathered from my blog posts on the matter, I'm an optimist. Like, I think that AI is not gonna rob our jobs mostly, and that we can use it to do like AI-aided writing, technical writing. I've seen that chart from Forrester. It puts like technical writing the dangerous spot where high automation and we are just there right for being replaced by machines, according to them, or at least according to the chart, depending on how you read it. But then, I think computer science programming is like in the middle, but it could be, it might well be together, with technical writing up at the top. Same for creative writing. What I think is that chart lacks a third dimension, which is complexity or depth. So depending on how you do technical writing, of course you can automate some bits, but if you do a certain type of technical writing, if you dig into some complex tutorials, if you write a book, for example, on a topic, let's say, that's harder to automate. And then I would also argue that the chart seems to focus a lot on the deliverables of technical writing. Like, someone thought, okay, so what do technical writers do? Oh, documentation. Yeah, of course that can be automated. Maybe they searched, they looked for some solutions, some prototype, and they thought, we can automate this. But technical writing is not so much about the deliverable, I would say, as it's the process is more important. How you get to the documentation, the kind of information you collect, the processes you set in motion. There's lots of project management. There's lots of soft skills involved with that, and also with good programming. So it's about focusing more about what makes our job, the human side of our job, what makes our job good to human beings, rather than just the deliverable. If we just focus on the deliverable, I think our job is at risk.
Yeah, that's an interesting call out about the whole processes aspect of technical writing. But you're certainly right. I think that I have processes for like release, of course, for sprint planning, processes around generating out new versions of docs, pushing it out. There's a lot of
Right.
complexity around that. I agree that would be hard to be automated. I mean, look, the reality is most people can't figure out how to even use these tools in their current jobs, let alone like do it all with with these tools.
Right.
So
Well,
it
for
seems
now,
very,
yeah.
yeah, it seems very future facing. And I was also frustrated by this report because it doesn't really define what it means by technical writing. It seems like the standard definition is
Yeah.
that of a very junior writer, where maybe an engineer has written something, hands it to a technical writer who tries to clean it up and make it readable and publish it. And if that were the extent of my job, I would have left this career like years and years ago,
Right.
because it would have been incredibly boring. So um, yeah, definitely for like the higher level technical writer, where you live in complexity, in ambiguity, where you're really trying to like uh, get to the heart of what should even be written.
Yeah.
That's a much more difficult task with AI. But at the same time, I do want to use. I do think, like you said, grouping technical writing with computer programming, you can use some of these tools to do parts of our job and tasks of our job. I was listening to a podcast with Sam Altman, the head of OpenAI. He was chatting with somebody. Well, maybe it was Joe Rogan. Okay, I don't usually listen to the Joe Rogan podcast, but
Right.
that was one I tuned in. He was
Yeah.
saying that AI is really good at tasks, not jobs. Like
Yeah.
not somebody's entire job, but specific tasks, at least for now. And I thought that was a good way of looking at it.
Yeah, which makes sense, in the, if you look at those as tools. I mean, we use tools every day. If we had a text editor, it would probably take way longer. Like, imagine our life without, say, Visual Studio Code or an IDE. Just getting Markdown right or Markdown tables right would be a nightmare. So it's okay to use tools, even if they're as complex as EI. Your remark there about the how we use words and how we define things reminded me of one of the articles that you recently discussed in your blog, which is the one about the word content. Right, I think it was Emma Thompson commenting about, and New York Times, was it?
Yeah.
Commenting about the word content and how generic it feels and how dry it feels. And again, that is the problem of defining our job by the deliverable. And in the most generic way, as content strategies is like a strategies of possibly everything, because its content can be everything. So perhaps there has to be a shift there from the deliverable to the processes that we set in motion, to the things we do in companies that are like, we are humanists in tech, I like to say. And so what it is that we do in tech, right? We are not just, developers are not just churning out code. Technical writers are not just writing documentation. They're doing something there that I think we have to define.
Let's move into that article called "Emma Thompson is Right. The word content is rude" by Jason Bailey. So yeah, this is some kind of a op-ed article in the New York Times commenting on Emma Thompson's rejection of the word content. And the context here is more of the writer's strike and how a lot of the creatives in Hollywood just really feel like their content is being stuffed into the same bag just by calling it content, whether you write plays or you're writing TV shows, films, movies, other kind of scripts, maybe even commercials. And it's just like all content, which is, that really caught me by surprise, because I had never heard objections to the word content. And we have that all over our profession: content strategy, content management, content this, content that. It's kind of like a substitute for documentation, I guess. But tries to be wider and include other sort of deliverables outside of that. Deliverables is another one of those generic words. But so you're saying that this emphasis on the output is what is sort of the danger, and you would rather see more emphasis on the process of a technical writer, that people just see us as producing documentation, and if they see that result, it sort of leads to the conclusion that it's easy to have some machine generated or something else generated.
Yeah, I think so. And it's yeah, I was thinking now that like performative arts, like doing a performance of something, poetry maybe, or there's another article you brought up in your digest about poets being hired by AI companies. So those performances are what makes our job not just unique and human, but also entertaining. You commented about how boring would it be to do the thing that machines do, right? So yeah, it's perhaps a little more difficult to conceptualize technical writing as poetry. We're probably not there, but there's something there that that my mind is still circling around. Like I wrote those articles about humor in documentation, for example. Like I'm trying to find the human bits, but I'm still far from having from getting to anywhere really.
I do think coming back to this whole content, usage of the word content, what we do isn't really all that creative and artistic. I think that most creatives would probably put documentation all into the same bag. It's not really, it doesn't, like release notes versus tutorials. Sure, there's a mountain of difference between good ones and bad ones, but what I think the creatives are really rebelling against is this rise of AI written content that is just kind of mediocre sludge or mediocre content. I swear, every time I'm reading an article on Medium, about half the time it looks AI generated. I'm getting more of a sense of it because I use these tools a lot, and I can recognize when something just looks very explanatory, a little bit wordy, distanced, some diction seems off, and I think people want to separate themselves from that kind of content. We're going to be drowning in so much content that people can push out entire books. Like I think Amazon created some kind of policy saying you can't publish more than 3 books a week or something, or a day, something insane, right? It's like, but let's play the future card here a little bit. Let's say that in 2 years, there's a lot of writers who are pushing out a lot of content. They're pushing out entire user guides in a day, and it's kind of lower quality than something that's more handcrafted. Maybe there'll be a desire to separate documentation based on auto-generated docs versus human written docs. I don't know.
Perhaps. I think it's this connects a bit with several of the topics we mentioned, and like things like brand recognition, for example, or I mean right now is AI sludge. The dangers of having lots of AI generated content in the web, low quality. But we already had a crisis like that with SEO optimized content. Like lots of articles with keyword stuffing, and we always had like a crisis like that. Right now, I would say, so a tutorial, several tutorials per day, lots of documentation getting out. I would actually welcome that if they are useful. If they are user tested and you see that the user accomplished something through those tutorials, that's okay. But on the other hand, I think part of the brand differentiation, part of what will make a tech brand successful, in my opinion, will be seeing the humans behind the process and seeing the human touch. So part of that is already there in the form of DevRel. I think you have developer relationships going on. You have people speaking at conferences, writing about their personal experience with the product, and that complements tutorials and docs very well. Perhaps somewhere in between, I think, is where the technical writers would have to find a connection.
Yeah. Hey, I want to return to the article on the poets that you brought up a little earlier, because this is sort of an emerging new role in the writer related world. But this other article, let's see what it's titled. This is somewhere here. in my list of articles to chat about. There was one on maybe that was a different one, but the title was something like "Poets are training LLMs on how to write Hindi and Japanese poetry because these are gaps where the LLMs really fail." And for some markets, it's a super high demand to be able to write original poetry in these languages. But in general, one job that's emerging is kind of this content designer with LLMs, where your job is to help shape the LLM's writing in some way. Maybe not poetry, but maybe it's like, hey, are these responses aligned with what one would expect or hope? Is the tone right? Or is, how does it deal with certain situations of hyperbole? There's another case where a prompt engineer was doing what's called red teaming, which is apparently working with LLMs around its responses to certain problematic situations, like somebody wants to make dangerously spicy chili. They're using dangerously as a hyperbole, but the LLM thinks that somebody's trying to commit harm. And so the LLM is confused and thinks, I can't help people, do that. So this content designer role where your output is now just like working with the output of the language model is a new one that's emerging. Is that something that appeals to you, or do you see that becoming more of a common role, content designer with LLM?
Well, I think we're just at the initial stage, and by the looks of it, that job doesn't look that different from content moderation, which brings lots of negative thought. We all read the articles about content moderation going on in major social media networks, etc. So you probably have to write lots of nasty prompts, for example, for red teaming, or feeding poetry, even if it's well paid. It kind of feels dehumanizing, as you commented. So, but I do think that the future will look more like being like AI herders, more or less, like shepherds of artificial intelligences or LLMs. And we are entering the realm of science fiction now, but I think it's entirely possible that we will have people specialize in communication with AIs, and well, LLMs is the most correct term right now. But we just need to see this evolving. But I do definitely see a future in this. Yeah.
I have a colleague who likes the term information reliability engineering, where your job is kind of to
Nice.
make sure the information coming out of LLMs is reliable. I don't know. But yeah, definitely it'll be interesting to see how this plays out. I said in my comments on that article that it must be demoralizing as a poet, because like if you successfully train the LLM to write poetry in Japanese, for example, then your job is done. and your skills are now kind of done as well. So anytime that's the long-term horizon of your job path, it seems pretty poor. Like even outside of poetry, just getting it to write tech docs. Let's say your job was to make sure that the tutorials had the right shape and the right approach and the right tone. You get that working really well, and suddenly,
there's but there's a couple of closely related job profiles that can see a resurgence with this, and one is the teacher, and the other is the editor. And if you think of the typical lone writer at a startup, not having enough resources to write 100 tutorials in a year, and if they get to be like an editor of an army of LLM generated content endpoints or whatever, that is actually a nice job to have. It's nice that we recover the this job description of the editor, the teacher even, and to those companies who are now trying to test LLMs and teach them poetry and feed them poetry, I would like to remind them that those jobs have existed for centuries. We have teachers, we have editors, And I think those roles can come back thanks to AI.
Yeah, yeah. We really are like entering a surgence of a lot of new possibilities. You mentioned having 100 tutorials, or you have like hundreds of tutorials that you might kind of look over and so on. Just the ability for these machines to cover so many gaps of documentation is pretty amazing. Um, just yesterday, I was trying to fix like a podcast feed, and
Yeah,
I was completely using the tutorials to understand both what was wrong with my iTunes feed and how to fix it. And this sort of like era of hyper personalized instruction where you want to have, in that case, I wanted to have like a tutorial on the right tags for an iTunes feed, as well as
right.
like how to fix the problems that were that existed with my current one. There's this other article in this list that we've got about hyper personalized content. And I really think these tools kind of usher in this era, not just like, hey, give me a tutorial on how to implement something, but like a tutorial tailored to your own content, to your very specific situation with the bugs that you're seeing. What are your thoughts on hyper personalization of content? You think this is a huge win in the help world?
I well, I'm a bit torn there. I think it sounds like a great idea. Um, I just feel quite skeptical about automated personalization in general, even if it's through AI. Um, I think first of all, I think the user might feel a bit weird about it. Uh, like, and I'm not just talking about providing sensitive data, which might happen. I mean, if you contact support from any, for any company, that conversation is protected. I'm not so sure about, speaking with an AI and a chatbot, or, maybe like content of this session will be wiped out once you close the window, something like that. I mean, that might work. But there's that problem, and then I think there's the problem of being overly specific. And once you unleash an AI helping a user and you cannot supervise it, there might be some risks there. So I'm not entirely sure that would work. I do think that the hyper personalization, on the other hand, to me, it means more like um, using that content and add yourself to that content as a human, and you're merging the best of two worlds there. But it's a completely different meaning for me.
Mhm. Yeah, I'm curious about more of the risks that you brought up. That I'm trying to see like what potential risks there are. For sure, like um, coming back to my podcast feed scenario, one risk is that my learning becomes very narrow. I learn only what I need to fix my problem, and I don't expand my knowledge in any other way.
Right.
And I don't become aware of things I don't even know I don't know about. There's no sense of deeper learning. It's just like, hey, what was the problem? Fix, bam, move on. And
Yeah.
that probably is short-sighting my skills in the long run. Yeah. Uh, well, why don't we shift into a different topic? Because you mentioned that you work in open source, and
Yeah.
there's an article that Daniel Beck wrote. I didn't really have a date on it. I thought it was recent, but it says the open source docs portfolio myth. Because we're talking about like learning and so on, and so when you have new technical writers who want to build their portfolios and show that they have learned technical writing, or that they've got some skills, they usually the typical advice is, hey, go find an open source project that needs documentation, go volunteer your skills to write the documentation. And a lot of these projects are super hungry for doc writers or for documentation. They like something like 90% of people say that the docs are poor, that they need help. But Daniel says, you know what? This is kind of a myth. People try to volunteer their skills, and they're met with resistance, silence. They don't make progress. It's an experience of frustration. And he really recommends like mm, changing your expectations. Instead of thinking, oh, I'm going to build my portfolio, think, oh, I'm going to learn how to work with like GitHub. I'm going to learn the mechanics of how communication is done on an open source project. What are your thoughts on Beck's article? Is he on target, or do you think there's still value in new writers trying to build portfolios this way?
So I think this article was very necessary in that, you know, it set the expectation straight. What happens with open source is that we often forget that there's always a community aspect to it, and community means there's a social code. There's there are people there who know each other or have been working together for a while. So it might seem like a collective building where, you know, someone passed by and dropped some code or some docs, but it's not that casual usually. What happens is that you have a small group of people, and you have to play the anthropologist a bit, especially if you're a writer, right? So you cannot just open a huge pull request out of the blue. You have to approach a project, maybe have a look at the issues. It takes time. So whenever I see, especially with things like the what is it, the week of docs or something like that. I don't remember the name right now. I think it's a Google initiative.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Yeah, so you see hordes of people going to repos and try to contribute a pull request, and I feel bad for them because they want to do good, right? But the communities don't seem so welcoming at the beginning, and it's true. It's just because they're a social group like any other, and you have to think in social terms, right? And I think this post does a good job at describing that situation. And I was remembering a very interesting book on the topic. Let me just check, by Alejandra Quetzali, which is Docs as Ecosystem. It's published by A Press, and it really delves into these aspects of, you know, collaborating and entering a community and what that means. So that's a significant shift from, you know, just thinking about, well, this is my code contribution, it compiles, pipelines are green, why doesn't it get through? Well, you have to think also about the context.
Interesting. Yes, I saw that book surface in the feeds, and it is it called Docs as Community? And you said the author is Alexandra
Docs as
Quetzali?
Ecosystem. Docs as Ecosystem by Alejandra Quetzali.
Yeah. And I think the book was sort of rejecting this Docs as code emphasis, where really the whole gist of things is like learning how to learning the software programming workflows that kind of make the content move along and get published. I hadn't connected it with this. This is that's a great connection. So, by the way, is that a book you've read entirely or just part way?
Part way right now. I must confess that I have a huge pile of books, but it was completely spot on in regards to this blog post by David.
Yeah. So seeing it as Docs as community and joining a community might be the way to really click with that. That's really cool. How did you get involved in open source, Fabrizio? Like you mentioned that this is what you currently kind of do and emphasize. I'm just curious, like, did you choose that, or was that just sort of where you landed by other
circumstances? At the very beginning, it was casual. My first contributions were to a Hugo theme, Doxy, which, by the way, is maintained by some Googles. That was before I was at Splunk. Then I joined Splunk, and a sizable amount of the products that we develop around observability are open source. And Splunk is a big contributor to OpenTelemetry, which is an open source project under the Linux Foundation. And so, you know, I found these tasks to be super interesting upstream, as we call it, like going to the open source that we then distribute. And there's so many interesting interactions there, because we do distribute the open source code of Splunk, but at the same time we contribute to it. And And it's not just code contribution, but it's also documentation. And I'm trying to improve that. And with that also came the community aspect. Like watching activity at the beginning, then starting to contribute, attending some meetings, some special interest group meetings, for example. So you have to embed yourself gently. Otherwise, even if you're part of the main contributors companies, there can be like a pushback.
Yeah, trying to connect this open source theme to LLMs, I think there is an interesting connection in that with so much of the content on GitHub being open, it's really ripe training grounds for a lot of LLMs, as I understand it.
Yeah.
I mean, got open access to all of this code, and from that, I think a lot of these tools can sort of extrapolate the logic and provide documentation about so many of those details. Do you think that LLMs might kind of bridge this gap between poor documentation with open source projects and fill this need? Like, you go to a project, you're trying to get it to work, it requires a bunch of steps with an unfamiliar technology to you, so you rely on other tools to kind of fill in the gaps of missing docs.
Well, especially, yes, the answer is yes, especially in those situations where you have, which happens a lot with open source, you have dependencies, which might be very fragile and under-documented. And in that situation, I think LLMs can really help bridge the gap. And okay, I have X, I want it to work, but it relies on Y and Z, and those are not documented or very poorly documented. But there might be code samples out there, and the process of doing that manually can take many hours or days. And with LLMs, at least you have a hint of how you could piece the things together. So LLMs, in that sense, are a very good tool for exploration in the open source wilderness.
Yeah, I was trying to use a tool. I can't remember this, but oh no, this was Mark Prompt. I was trying to get it to work, and a certain implementation path required a lot of information about Node. And I know Node is a huge thing. I should probably be really familiar with it and all the different tools and setup, but I wasn't. And their documentation just assumed that somebody would have that sort of Node background, and it did. I used ChatGPT to really fill in a lot of the blanks there. So I think there was another article that I was recently talking about, MDN's AI Explain feature, where part of the challenge that we're trying to do is provide instructions for features that were split across different pages, or code samples for features that were explained on different pages. And it's the same concept here, where you've got lots of different pages, and maybe the code you need requires you to be familiar with like 10 different pages, and it's just too much to ask for that documentation to somehow explain all those other areas. Hey, I'm kind of curious, what sort of AI tools do you experiment with? Like, do you if you need to use an AI tool, what's your go-to tool? Is it ChatGPT? Is it Claude, Bard, Poe, Perplexity, even U.com?
So for now, I use Copilot at home, and ChatGPT as well. Just vanilla ChatGPT. I tried Bing search, but I didn't find it so good. And mostly I use it for technical stuff. From time to time I might entertain myself with some questions about philosophy or things like that, but it's mostly technical stuff. Then I also tried out Mark Prompt. I think that was a very cool idea, but I think it still needs lots of development. There are companies out there trying it out, trying similar solutions, and you always get to the point where it's not really time to hello world. I would say is time to I don't know. And the time to I don't know is the time till you get the AI to admit that they don't know how to do something. and that time
Hmm.
is still very short with lots of tools. Like, you start asking something complex, and all of a sudden, either the training set is not sufficient, or I don't know, maybe the settings are too conservative, but you get to the I don't know point, which is like the 404 of LLMs.
Hmm. I hadn't heard that phrase before. Time to I don't know. I kind of like that. So
I might have invented it. I don't know if it exists. But
um, this brings up a question I haven't really fully resolved in my mind. The difference and the trade-offs between a specialized LLM that's trained on a very specific body of docs, sort of like a micro LLM, versus more of a macro LLM that's has one-stop shopping for almost any type of question you have. And the latter, the one-stop shop experience is subject to a lot more hallucination than the
yeah.
micro LLM. What's your preference? Would you rather use a specialized LLM that's going to have very quick boundaries on what it knows? Maybe it's not trained on Node, for example, and so it can't help you with that. It can only help you with maybe the product that you're working with. Or would you?
Well, ideal scenario, that would be like a switch. Like, okay, so be the generalist, be the specialist, and then you can compare. If I were a doctor, of course, yeah, I would rather use the specialized one, like, especially if it's about the very sensitive stuff like surgery or things like that. I don't know if there's been any application, by the way, in medicine, but I think it's okay not to drop entirely, even if it hallucinates. There's a richness in the general models, in the know-it-all. And perhaps I feel sympathy for those approaches, because I think technical writers are also generalists, and we bring many diverse skill sets and knowledge to our field, which might, add something different. So
Yeah.
I would keep the field open also for the general models.
Yeah, that's a good connection about how tech writers are generalists, and so that might appeal more to that mindset. Because certainly, like when I'm using technology, I'm trying to learn about something, I only need a very basic understanding of it, and especially if the information is online somewhere, then usually that is enough for me. But if I were a specialist engineer working with something very kind of complex and deep, yeah, I would probably prefer the specialist LLM and be very not have a lot of patience for error and so on. So it's interesting. Now you mentioned that you don't really use it for stuff outside of tech. What about your blog, passo.uno? And by the
Yeah.
way, mention your blog and your URL in this response. But tell me, do you not find it useful to use an AI at all with any of your blog efforts, from coding to idea generation to other tasks?
So I might have tried a couple times, maybe a few months ago, but the perhaps ChatGPT doesn't know that much about technical writing. I don't know, but it didn't really come up with things that appeal to me. Like the kind of topics I like to write about. They were very generic, but perhaps it was also because of the kind of prompts I was providing. I found more value in generating pictures using DALL-E, which I think you also do. And I did that for one of my last posts, the bestiary thing. I wanted to create this medieval content taxonomy, but the illustration part, well, that would have taken ages. So I just relied on AI for that, which is in itself an example of AI assisting a writer, right? With some content. But for writing itself, no, not really. Actually, now that you said it, I might try again. But perhaps there's a psychological block there. I don't want to, like, I wouldn't feel honest, in doing that. So I think people come to my blog because they feel like what I write is very personal, very opinionated, has personality. And using ChatGPT, I'm pretty sure they would notice that something isn't quite right.
Yeah. Well, this whole topic of honesty is an interesting one. But before I do want to comment on that briefly, but coming back to the images, for sure, if you just have long walls of text in your blog, the images, adding images can really spice it up and make it
Yeah,
interesting. Your post on the bestiary compendium, it was very creative and it had cool images. I was most fascinated, honestly, by the fact that you were able to get images that all seem like part of a collection. That's really hard to match the same style and approach from
yeah,
one image to the next. Maybe it's because of the style. Maybe I don't know, but really struggle with that. It seems like every image looks different.
yeah. But
Artistic.
you see, there's the value that the human writer brings is, for example, curation, which is something that I think will be out of reach of AIs for a long time, if always. Like, because you have to take a step back from whatever problem space that the AIs are focusing on. And that context switching, that zooming out is not really a thing within the reach of a general purpose artificial intelligence.
Mhm.
Or so I like to think. But for now, that's the situation, right? So
Yeah.
whenever there's something like editing, curating, watching for voice and tone, that's where we can really bring value.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. If you just, give the AI kind of open reign to add images, it would be a disaster, right? You have to
Right.
very carefully steer that and provide input and direction and other judgment. Now let's look at this other aspect of your comment about the honesty element. This is something that I've wrestled with this as well. For example, in a lot of my newsletter summary posts, newsy summary posts, where I haven't really been doing this that long, but I try to like find interesting related news to TechCom,
Yeah.
summarize it, and comment on it. Well, for the summaries, definitely rely on some summary tools just to speed things up,
Yeah. Yeah.
whether it's Claude, ChatGPT, Bard, or some other tool. And uh, my feeling right now, anyway, is that if people can't tell if something is machine generated or not, it really doesn't matter. I used to feel a lot more like, oh, I'm cheating, I'm plagiarizing, I'm being dishonest. And then I thought, you know what? What's the difference between somebody who uses Grammarly to fix all the grammar and style, or uses WordTune or something else,
Yeah.
or who even has like a human editor that he or she is passing many drafts through, and maybe the editors, maxing out their red pen and all the changes and so on. At what point do you say um, they're just different gradations of assistance for things, and why should I feel conflicted? It's not as if I'm signing. Well, I guess I was going to say signing my name to something. I guess I am, but it's not like an artist who's putting their autograph on a painting, for example.
Yeah.
It's not really a work of art. It's much more functional. But
Yeah. But
yeah,
that you mentioned artists, right? Like great guitar players have their signature guitar, or great pianists have their favorite instruments, sing for violin, etc. Painters have their tool of choice. So what I would like to see in the future, and probably this is already cooking, is um, let's say that tomorrow I'm writing my blog, and at the same time I'm also presenting my own LLM trained by myself with its own name and identity. So I'm not using Bard, I'm not using ChatGPT, I'm using Fabio. Let's call it like that. Um, my own LLM, and that's also is my own signature, just in a different form, which is a system made, but it's not the generic one. So nobody else can have it. So
yeah,
there's also that part there. It's like your own personal Star Wars droid, so to speak.
yeah. I agree. Like that's an extreme case where let's say you've trained the LLM to respond in a certain way. That's definitely a reflection of your expertise. Even without going that far, if you know how to like write a prompt in a way that gets the response that you want, that's really on target, there should be some kind of credit for that. Like you can't
Yeah.
just say, "Oh, this post was written by Chat GPT," as if it just like did everything. I tried to write a post the other week where I would kind of describe what I wanted it to say for every single paragraph, which seems
Yeah.
incredibly tedious and
Yeah.
it didn't really work out that well. But it was my attempt to kind of use these tools in a more directed way. And at the end of that, would I say, "Oh, this is just written by Claude AI"? You know, like, well, I mean, there's a lot of input there, and direction and steering and
Yeah.
judgment. It wasn't
Yeah.
just like click a button, here it is. Um, anyway, but yeah, this whole issue of ethics definitely makes a lot of us uneasy, and it's different mindset. And for sure, um, part of the writing process that's rewarding is thinking through things yourself and making connections and
Yeah.
realizations and discovery along the way. So I don't want to like remove that element of writing, but at the same time, I don't want to be antiquated and not like able to leverage tools that are available that
Yeah.
speed up, especially the mundane parts of writing. So
Yeah. No, I totally agree. And I think that getting back to the general theme of is AI gonna get our jobs or similar themes or topics? Well, I think that we are not really antiquated when we say that this is not a problem of AIs can be problematic only if you assign initiative to them that they don't have. Like I think we are attributing initiative and will to things that don't have it, and that's a very human thing to do. We humanize everything, and we think of AIs as Terminator or robots with their own goals and initiative, and that's not the case. LLMs are completely passive until you provide a prompt, and the element of initiative, the element of self-starting something, that's still human, and that's still on us. We give direction, and machines cannot have that. It's practically impossible that they can have initiative. It's something that, at least in my opinion, with the little psychology I studied in college, I think that belongs only to the organic matter realm.
yeah,
Well, the best we can do is not to think about LLMs as independent agents. They're not. They're not.
yeah, that's a good way of that's a good perspective to have, and definitely it comes back to this comment I made earlier about using these as tools to perform tasks instead of entire
Yeah.
jobs.
Yeah.
Because as a job, you have much more of the agent and the individual direction that is needed. All right, Fabrizio, we've talked about a lot of articles. I think let's wrap this up. Can you tell people a little bit about like passo.uno, how people find you online, and let's say they want to just follow you or reach out to you, what should they do?
Sure. So if you look for me, well, I guess you will see my name in the podcast once it's online. You can Google me. I'm on LinkedIn mostly, also on Twitter and Mastodon. But my blog is self-hosted.
Mhm.
I strongly believe in self-hosting content. In terms of retaining property of it. See, we're back at the word content. And the name is passo.uno, which is passo.uno is an Italian expression for stop motion. I explain a little bit more in the about of my blog, but why I called it like that. But yeah, it's passo.uno. You cannot miss it.
Cool. And I'll add a link to that in the show notes. And
Thanks.
yeah, I'll include your name. You know, I messed up your name in an earlier post. Instead of Fabrizio, I said Fabio. And now I see
Well,
why
that happens all the time.
I see why you thought it was so funny though, because like the Fabio guy has such long flowing hair.
Right, but I felt a bit old with the reference. Like I feel like the younger generations do not get it.
Yeah, yeah, for sure, for sure. Anyway, thanks again for coming on here and chatting with me about all these
Thank you.
TechCom topics. I really appreciate it.
Thanks.